Political parties are an intriguing and controversial aspect of American politics. On the one hand, parties help voters make sense of the political world. They take stands on issues they believe to be broadly popular with the American public, and by competing in elections, they attempt to bring more Americans into the voting public. But on the other hand, Americans are becoming increasingly skeptical of both major parties, and there is some evidence that the parties are actually increasing the divisions amongst Americans. This lecture file will supplement the very good discussion of parties contained in your textbook by highlighting some of the major functions of parties, and especially pointing out ways in which our current era of political polarization is exemplified by the major parties. I want to start with this observation from the political scientist Julia Azari, made shortly after the 2016 presidential election. I think it captures one of the most important trends going on in American politics today. She states, "After observing what's gone on this election cycle, I've come to this conclusion. The defining characteristic of our moment is that parties are weak while partisanship is strong." What she's getting at here is that parties have changed in some pretty fundamental ways in recent years. Parties have become weak in the sense that party leaders and party organizations, the folks who work to define what parties stand for and who runs for office under party labels, have lost control of party agendas. It might be somewhat overlooked today, but for most of the 2016 presidential primary campaign, most Republican Party leaders were strongly opposed to Donald Trump's candidacy. They did not consider him to be a loyal Republican, and they thought some of his positions that he took during the campaign were out of line with the positions of most Republicans. They viewed Trump's ascendancy as something of a hostile takeover of the party. Yet they were powerless to stop his nomination because Trump demonstrated enough support with Republican primary voters. Meanwhile, on the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton, who is the favorite of party insiders, very nearly lost the nomination to Bernie Sanders, a candidate who had always labeled himself as an independent and was never formally affiliated with the Democratic Party. These primary races demonstrated that party organizations have lost much control over messaging and the selection of their candidates. Yet, when the general election came around, the results were shockingly similar to past elections. Most voters voted the way they generally do. Just a marginal shift in votes was enough for Donald Trump to carry key states such as Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania and win the Electoral College. The takeaway here is that partisanship, voting on the basis of party identification, is stronger than ever, even as party leadership has lost a great deal of control over the process. The essence of political parties is that they are teams of people who seek to gain control of government by winning elections. This means they must try to appeal broadly throughout American society in order to win a majority of votes, meaning they have a much more wide-ranging agenda than, for instance, interest groups, which focus much more narrowly on specific areas of concern. In seeking broad appeal, parties are made up of coalitions of different groups in society. For instance, the Republican coalition tends to include many religious conservatives who are motivated by social issues such as abortion, as well as corporate interests that seek lower tax rates and less regulation of private enterprise. There's no inherent reason why these two groups should necessarily be bound together in a single party. They often struggle between themselves for power within the party, but they're aligned because they know that they can't win elections unless they cobble together votes from different societal groups. Similarly, the Democratic coalition includes both environmentalists and civil rights activists, two groups that don't inherently share the same interests, but nevertheless have aligned themselves within the party. As organizations that seek to gain governmental power by winning elections, parties perform a number of important functions in American politics. They simplify voting by providing cues to voters. While Americans like to claim that they vote for the person, not the party, this can often be difficult as it's a pretty daunting process to learn enough personal details about all the candidates for all the races on the ballot to make an informed individual decision about each one. But party labels carry a lot of information about where candidates likely stand on important issues, simplifying the decision-making process for voters. Parties also recruit candidates, trying to encourage people to run under the party label who they think would make for high-quality elected officials. Of course, as the earlier quote demonstrated, party control over who runs under the party label is limited. Candidates can recruit themselves to run, even if party leaders do not support them. Parties also coordinate campaigns, highlighting issues of common concern to the party. We saw this in the most recent midterm election, with Democrats throughout the country emphasizing health care as the #1 issue their candidates raised throughout the campaign. Parties also coordinate campaigns by sharing critical resources, such as volunteers to knock on doors, encouraging voters to support the party's candidates. Additionally, parties coordinate policymaking by working across the branches of government to come up with plans of action. So even though the separation of powers means the president and members of Congress might have certain differences, a shared party label provides encouragement for them to work together to come up with legislation that the party supports. Finally, parties play the critical role of mobilizing citizens to become voters. Since parties compete in elections, they have a strong built-in incentive to try to bring new people into the electoral system as a way of maximizing their votes. When talking about political parties, it's useful to think about the different aspects of party structure. Party in the electorate has to do with voters' ties to one political party or another. Party organization has to do with the formal structure of the party and the people who actually work for political parties. And party in government has to do with elected officials who run for office under a party label. Party in the electorate deals with how the general public identifies itself with political parties. In the United States, you can identify yourself as a party member simply by saying, "I'm a Republican," or "I'm a Democrat," or "I'm a member of the Green Party." Unlike in some countries, there are no dues to pay and no formal requirements of membership. The most important trend with the party in the electorate in recent years has been the rise of independents. Now, I put independents in scare quotes because, as we'll see in a moment, it's a matter of some debate as to how truly independent of the two major parties these folks actually are. The other important trend is the decline in what's called ticket splitting. This is when a voter votes for a candidate from one party in one race, but a candidate from a different party in another race in the same election. You would think that if voters are actually becoming more independent of the two major parties, voters would be more inclined to split their votes between Republicans and Democrats in different races. But in fact, the opposite is actually occurring. More and more voters are voting Republican straight down the line in all races, or Democrat straight down the line in all races. This graph shows the rise of independents in polling data taken by the Gallup organization over the last 30 years. As of 2015, 42% of the American public considered themselves to be independent, a much larger group than either folks who call themselves Democrats or folks who call themselves Republicans. But as we dig deeper down, it appears that most independents actually lean toward one party or the other. Independents who lean Democratic tend to behave pretty much like Democrats, at least in terms of how they vote. Similarly with independents who lean Republican. Only about 12%, or 1 out of 8 Americans, is truly independent, with no leaning toward one party or the other. That 12% can, and sometimes does, have a substantial impact on elections, as they can provide the decisive votes to give one party or the other the votes they need to win an election. But true independents, because they don't have strong partisan ties, are also much less likely to vote than people who identify with a political party, thus limiting their electoral influence. Part of what's going on here is the declining favorability of both major political parties. In other words, we've reached a point where more Americans don't want to be affiliated with either political party because they view them both unfavorably, but they still lean towards one party because they really, really dislike the other party. Your textbook discusses negative partisanship, the idea that voters form loyalty to a party based on negative opinions of the opposing party. One of the most dramatic pieces of evidence that I've seen regarding the rise of negative partisanship is shown in the following survey results. Back in 1958, the Gallup organization asked a sample of Americans, if you had a daughter of marriageable age, would you prefer she marry a Democrat or a Republican, all other things being equal? At that time, most Americans, 72%, didn't care about the party affiliation of their potential in-laws. Partisanship just wasn't a very important signifier of identity. But in 2016, political scientists at UCLA had the idea of asking this question again to see if things had changed. They changed the question slightly to be more gender neutral, asking about a son or daughter of marriageable age, but otherwise the question was the same. This time the results were dramatically different. Now, over half the population cared about the partisan identification of their potential son or daughter-in-law. Party has become a much more important social signifier to people than it was in the past. So even though more people today claim to be independent of the major political parties, factors such as negative partisanship have actually made Americans more partisan in their voting behavior. This chart shows straight ticket versus split ticket results for Senate and presidential races going back to 1916. The percentages are what percent of states went to the same party's candidate for president and Senate versus the percent of states that voted for one party's candidate for Senate and the other party's candidate for president. So, for example, focus in on the data for 1984 and 1988. In those years, states were just as likely to split their votes between Republicans and Democrats as they were to vote for the same party for both offices, both the Senate and the presidency. But in 2016, for the first time since the Constitution was amended to allow the direct election of senators, every state went straight ticket. In other words, every state that voted for Donald Trump also sent a Republican to the Senate, and every state that voted for Hillary Clinton also sent a Democrat to the Senate. This is the culmination of a long trend that's been in the works for a few decades now, as more and more states, as well as the voters within those states, have sorted themselves out more clearly along party lines. So we've just discussed the most important trends regarding the party and the electorate. Now I'm going to briefly touch on party as an organization. I won't spend long on this aspect of parties, as your textbook does an excellent job of handling this topic. I just want to emphasize that party organizations are the people who keep the lights on in the party between elections. They help keep party coalitions together, as the networks of people within the party and affiliated interest groups work together on things like fundraising, candidate recruitment, and voter registration for the next upcoming election. It's important to know that in American politics, party organizations are very decentralized and fragmented compared to most democracies. Most party activists are active at the local level, trying to organize and build support for the party within a city or town or even a single precinct. Party organizations are quite weak in the system compared to candidates and interest groups. In other words, candidates can establish their own campaign resources independently of party organizations, and interest groups provide far more campaign funding than the parties do. This makes American party organizations weak compared to parties in other democracies. Our third aspect of parties, party and government, is made up of party members who are actually elected to government. Party and government provides a bridge to overcome the separation of powers. In other words, it provides an incentive for members of the same party to work together across the House, Senate, and White House. So even though party organizations are weak, you wouldn't know it by the voting behavior of elected officials. Party identification is the strongest predictor of how a member of Congress will vote. We can see this in the current Congress, where all but 14 Republican members of the House have voted with President Trump at least 88% of the time. In other words, the Trump score tracks how often a member of Congress votes in line with the president's preferences when the president has publicly taken a position on an issue up for vote in Congress. And none of the 51 Republican senators has a Trump score below 80%. This is not unique to President Trump. During President Obama's administration, Democratic members of Congress voted in line with President Obama's position nearly as often as Republicans now support President Trump. Another way of looking at partisanship in government is to look at how often members of Congress overlap in their votes. This series of scatter plots shows the overlap on party line votes going back to 1949 and through 2011, with each blue dot representing a Democratic member of Congress and each red dot representing a Republican member of Congress, and the gray shading representing overlapping votes. So in other words, on votes where a majority of Democrats voted one way and a majority of Republicans voted the other way, just how much separation was there between the two parties? In the upper rows, you can see that even though there are clear blue and red groupings, there are still a lot of interconnections, representing times when members of Congress crossed party lines in their votes. By the mid-1990s, we can see that overlap shrinking dramatically, and by 2000 and beyond, almost no members of Congress willing to cross party lines on controversial votes. In a constitutional system set up to prioritize consensus building over simple majority rule, this is a recipe for gridlock and is one of the main reasons why it's become harder and harder for Congress to pass major legislation in recent years. I want to finish this discussion of party and polarization by showing you a series of slides detailing how the parties have drifted apart from one another on issues of major concern in American society. These slides all look at party and the electorate as they show how Democrats and Republicans in society have changed their views on key issues in recent years. The data in these slides come from the Pew Research Center and the Gallup organization. The first slide has to do with economic fairness, and it asks whether the economic system unfairly favors powerful interests or is generally fair to most Americans. We can see here that Republicans are much more evenly divided in their views of economic fairness, whereas Democrats are strongly and increasingly likely to view the system stacked in favor of powerful interests. In terms of economic opportunity, Democrats are divided over whether they think most people who want to get ahead can make it if they're willing to work hard, whereas a strong majority of Republicans agree with that statement. As recently as 2008, there was not much difference between Republicans and Democrats over whether government regulation of business is necessary to protect the public interest. But in recent years, Democrats have grown stronger in their belief that government regulation of business is necessary, whereas Republicans have become much more skeptical of government regulation. Back in 2002, when Gallup asked whether the federal government has too much power, there was little difference between Democrats and Republicans. By 2016, Republicans had become much more skeptical of federal power. While there's always been some difference between the parties on gun regulation, in recent years, Democrats have become more supportive of stricter gun laws, while Republicans have become less supportive of such laws. Democrats have maintained their high level of support for government provision of health care coverage, while Republicans have become much less supportive of government-sponsored health insurance. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, while there was always a difference between the parties on environmental issues, that difference was not very large. Now a chasm has emerged, with Democrats becoming more supportive of environmental regulations and Republicans becoming much less so. We see the same trend in terms of whether the government should do more to help the needy. In terms of gender issues, Republicans are considerably more likely to say that obstacles that once made it harder for women to get ahead are largely gone, whereas Democrats are more likely to say that significant obstacles still make it harder for women to get ahead than men. In terms of civil rights and race, the parties remain far apart on the question of whether the country needs to continue making changes to give blacks equal rights with whites. In terms of foreign affairs, Democrats are far more likely to say good diplomacy is the best way to ensure peace, whereas Republicans are more likely to emphasize military strength as the best way to ensure peace. In terms of immigration, as recently as a decade ago, both parties were split as to whether immigrants strengthen the country because of their hard work and talents. While Republican support for this idea dipped for a time, by 2017 it was back near the same level as it was in the mid-aughts. What's really changed is that Democrats have become much more pro-immigration over the last several years. And finally, one issue where the parties have differences, but are moving in the same direction, and that is the percentage of people who say homosexuality should be accepted by society. To sum up those slides on issues separating the two major parties, the key takeaway is that ideological differences are increasingly partisan differences, with Democrats becoming more consistently liberal in their positions and Republicans becoming more consistently conservative in their positions. On most issues, these differences have been growing in recent years. A silver lining perspective on this development would be that these trends make it easier than ever for voters to identify which party best represents their interests. The downside, however, is that as the parties have become more sharply polarized, there is less and less room for party members in government to work together and reach compromises. I wish I could leave you all with a sunnier assessment of the party system in American government, but it's important to understand the very real dramatic challenges these trends pose to effective governance.